Walter Emery had lived a quiet life after retiring from teaching history. At 72, his knees weren't what they used to be, but the man had a stubborn streak when it came to the outdoors. Friends and family described him as disciplined, methodical, and endlessly curious. Hiking alone was his ritual, a way of proving to himself that age hadn't beaten him. On September 28, 2008, with the aspens just starting to turn and the air carrying the first chill of autumn, Walt drove his old pickup to the Elk Ridge trailhead. He signed the register at 8:42 a.m., neat handwriting, no flourish. Next to his name, he wrote a short note. Heading up to see the first snow. A ranger remembered him pausing, leaning on his trekking pole, and adding with a smile, "Might be the last good walk of the season." When he didn't return that night, his family's worry grew quickly. Walt wasn't careless. He carried a watch, checked in before trips, and had a habit of leaving detailed notes about his routes. By 9 the next morning, his daughter filed a missing persons report. The sheriff's office notified search and rescue, and the incident command post was set up by noon. The situation was already complicated. A cold front had dropped in almost without warning. Temperatures plunged, sleet fell in waves, and dense fog smothered the ridge. Helicopters were grounded, thermal drones launched, but the ice mist blinded their sensors. For a 72-year-old man alone on the mountain, time was the enemy. Search teams swept outward from the trail register, marking grids, checking side paths, and probing drainages. They found no clear tracks, no discarded gear, no sign of camp. Dogs picked up a faint trace at the lower switchbacks, but lost it on frozen rock slabs. The official report noted severe weather degradation of scent conditions. Within 48 hours, hope began to thin. A hiker that age, caught in freezing sleet without shelter, usually didn't last long. By the end of the third day, the language shifted. Radios stopped saying rescue. They started saying recovery. Yet, small, unsettling details emerged. Walt's truck, parked neatly at the trailhead, had been locked from the outside. Inside, everything was tidy. A folded jacket, a water bottle half full, and his trail register slip tucked into the visor. But in the truck bed, investigators noticed something strange. His spare boots were gone. Walt had left home wearing well-worn hiking shoes, but he usually carried a second pair of heavier boots for rough terrain. His family confirmed they weren't at the house. That meant he'd taken them, but if he swapped shoes at some point on the mountain, there should have been a sign. None was ever found. More curious was a piece of paper in the glove box, a hand-drawn map, faint pencil lines traced across the printed topo sheet. They weren't official trails, but rough dotted marks following ridgelines and plunging into areas with no established paths. Beside one line, Walt had written a single word: water. The search coordinator flagged it, but with weather conditions collapsing and no way to chase every possible line, they had to focus on the most logical routes. The penciled map went into the evidence file. No one knew whether Walt had been following it that day, or if it was just the product of idle curiosity from his notebooks at home. The sleet storm raged on, covering old tracks and tearing down branches. Volunteers pushed deeper, calling his name into empty ravines. A whistle was heard once, faint on the fourth evening, but by the time a team reached the spot, the fog was so thick they couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead. Whether it was Walt or just the wind playing tricks would never be answered. By the 10th day, the operation wound down. Exhausted teams packed out, and the incident command posted a final update. No subject located. Area searched 54 square miles. Status suspended. Officially, the case went cold, but the details lingered in people's minds. A careful man, a sudden storm, a locked truck, missing boots, and a hand-drawn map pointing to places no one else seemed to know. His family was left with a haunting contradiction. Had Walt simply lost his way and fallen victim to the weather? Or had he gone looking for something else entirely, something hidden out there in the stone and fog of Elk Ridge? That question, unanswered, was the one that refused to fade, and in the years to come, it would grow larger, casting doubt on the idea that Walter Emery had ever just disappeared into the snow. By the second full day of searching, the dogs finally caught something. At a ridge saddle where the wind cut sharp and the ground broke into jagged limestone, Two K9 units stiffened and pulled forward almost in unison. Their handlers reported a strong alert, circling tightly, noses pressed to the ground. The scent carried for about 50 yards, drawing the teams along a faint game path barely visible in the thin crust of sleet. Then, just as suddenly, the dogs faltered. The path gave way to fractured rock, where the earth seemed to have swallowed itself. Sinkholes gaped open like black mouths, some no wider than a trash can lid, others broad enough to lose a truck in. The limestone field was a known hazard in that area, unstable, honeycombed, riddled with caverns underneath. Whatever trace the dogs had locked onto, it dissolved into the stone. Volunteers began combing the area by hand, stringlining to keep from losing each other in the fog. Late one evening, as daylight faded into the kind of gray that blurs horizon lines, a pair of searchers swore they heard a whistle. It came once, then again, faint and high-pitched, echoing just beyond the tree line. Radios crackled as teams converged, but by the time they spread through the saddle, the sound was gone. Some dismissed it as the wind howling through the karst cuts, a trick the mountains played often. Others whispered it could have been Walt, signaling in the only way he could. Without proof, it remained another ghost note in a growing list of maybes. On the fourth day, a single boot print gave everyone hope. Pressed into the sleet-packed earth just off the game path, it matched Walt's known size. The pattern was worn, shallow on the heel, consistent with the shoes he'd been wearing when he set out. But the print stood alone. Beyond it stretched only bare rock, unbroken and slick. Teams widened their sweep, circling outward, searching for a second impression, a snapped twig, a scrap of fabric. They found nothing. The track ended as if he had stepped out of the world. Inside the command tent, the debate shifted to whether a full cave search should begin. The karst field was notorious, a labyrinth of holes and underground channels mapped only in fragments. Cave rescue specialists would be required, ropes, anchors, confined space protocols. And the weather was unrelenting, sleet hammering the ridges, fog choking visibility, freezing rain turning entrances into glass. Helicopter support was grounded entirely. Without aerial coverage, every step into the karst was a risk. Leadership weighed lives against lives. With no firm indication Walt had gone below ground, they decided to hold off. Meanwhile, a neighbor stepped forward with something that shifted attention. Walt, he explained, had a personal quirk. Well, whenever he hiked off established trails, he left behind small cairns, 2 stones stacked deliberately, always the same. It was his breadcrumb system, a way to orient himself and, if needed, let others know he had passed through. Teams, now briefed on this, began scanning more carefully for stacks among the brush. 2 days later, about a quarter mile from the saddle, one was found. A neat pile, just 2 rocks high, balanced at the edge of an unmarked cut in the trees. It was small, ordinary enough to escape casual notice, but unmistakable to those who knew his habit. Beyond it, the forest closed in, the ground falling steeply into shadows. They pressed forward, hopeful, but the cairn stood alone. No second marker appeared, no path, no shelter, no personal effects, just silence and sleet. Morale slipped as the days bled together. 10 days of exposure in those conditions for a man in his 70s was beyond survivability by standard charts. The dogs were exhausted, the volunteers soaked and frostbitten. The radio logs shifted tone, less urgency, more resignation. On the 10th evening, Incident Command called it, demobilization would begin at dawn. Crews packed their gear in silence. Officials reassured the family that winter cave teams would return, sweep the karst when conditions improved, and rule out the underground. But as weeks turned to months, and months to years, that promise dissolved. Funding dried up, priorities shifted, and the cave search never came. What lingered instead were fragments, a lost scent at a limestone saddle, a whistle no one could trace, a single boot print pressed into the earth, and one small cairn pointing toward nowhere. For Walt's family, it meant not closure, but a deepening uncertainty. The mountain had given just enough to suggest he had been there, then sealed the rest away. And as winter buried Elk Ridge under ice, the unanswered question grew heavier. Had Walt fallen to the storm, or had the ground itself hidden him in places no one ever dared to look? In the weeks after the search was called off, Walt's family began the painful work of sorting through his belongings. His daughter opened the garage, a space that looked more like a small supply depot than a retiree's hobby shop. Shelves were stacked with labeled bins, each holding neatly folded gear, ponchos, hand warmers, rope, first aid kits, water filters still sealed in plastic. A clipboard on the wall bore handwritten checklists for day hikes, overnight hikes, and even short walks. On the table, his most recent pack was laid out exactly as if he'd been preparing for another trip, except this time he hadn't come back to unpack it. The contents said a lot about the man. A foil emergency blanket, 3 spare lighters, and a cheap disposable camera sealed in a plastic bag. In a side pouch was a laminated card, edges frayed from years of use, printed with wilderness survival notes, Morse code signals, hypothermia stages, instructions for shelter building. To the family, it was proof he hadn't gone into Elk Ridge recklessly. He knew the risks, and he prepared not just for himself, but in case someone else needed help. It was something friends had noticed for years. On group hikes, Walt was the one carrying extra gloves, extra water, and extra sandwich. He had a habit of quietly slipping supplies into other people's packs without telling them. He packed for others, one old colleague said. He couldn't help it. That generosity, however, had begun to carry a different edge in the years before his disappearance. Friends recalled Walt talking more and more about people who never came back from the ridge. In 2002, a 17-year-old trail crew member had gone missing during a storm. Despite a week-long search, no trace of him was ever found. Then, in 2005, a seasonal worker employed at a nearby ranch vanished on his day off. Both cases had ended without closure. Walt, who lived just miles from the trailhead, had clipped every article, saved every flyer. In conversations, he often circled back to them, wondering aloud what had really happened. He didn't believe both could be chalked up to accidents. His family found evidence of that obsession in a spiral-bound notebook on his workbench. Inside were pages of hand-drawn trail junctions, rough maps with arrows pointing into side drainages, and margins filled with notes. In several places he had written the same phrase, "Listen for water under rock." It was unclear whether he meant underground streams, caves, or simply a landmark only he recognized. To detectives reviewing the file, the phrasing suggested he had been thinking about the karst system, the hidden underworld of limestone and caverns that SR had been forced to bypass. Walt may have believed that those missing hikers had stumbled into one of those openings, and he might have gone out there to test his own theory. The possibility troubled investigators. If Walt had indeed been exploring sinkholes or prospectors' cuts, it meant he hadn't simply been caught in a storm. He might have put himself in a position few rescuers could safely reach. And yet, there was another angle that couldn't be ignored. Those who knew him well described a man with a strong moral compass, someone who felt responsible for others even when he didn't have to. Detectives considered whether Walt might have crossed paths with someone in need, another hiker underprepared for the storm, perhaps someone disoriented or injured. In that scenario, he could have gone off trail to try to help, carrying his extra gear, giving away what little time he had to save another. If that was the case, he had paid the highest price for his kindness. The notebook left behind only deepened the ambiguity. One page contained a crude sketch of a ravine with an X marked near its base. Another showed a winding dotted line across the ridge, ending at the word "stop" scrawled heavily in pencil. None of these sketches corresponded cleanly to official maps, making it impossible to know whether they were based on real landmarks or just ideas Walt meant to investigate later. The disposable camera in his pack, never recovered, hinted that he had intended to document something. Whether he found it or whether it was still hidden with him somewhere in the limestone remained unknown. As detectives closed their file for the season, the portrait of Walt Emery had grown sharper but no less confounding. He was careful but restless, compassionate but stubborn, the kind of man who prepared for others yet pushed himself into dangerous places, searching for answers that haunted him. The question that hung over the case was no longer just how a 72-year-old man vanished in a storm, but whether he had walked deliberately into places that others feared, chasing mysteries that had claimed lives before. And if he had, the mountain was now keeping those secrets with him. When the official search wound down and the sheriff's office filed the paperwork marking the case inactive, the story didn't disappear. It drifted, the way unsolved things do, into the corners of town talk. In the valley below Elk Ridge, people who had seen Walt over the years, or thought they had, began sharing fragments that painted very different pictures. A seasonal outfitter who ran pack trips for tourists each summer swore he knew of two rough local men who lived near the ridgeline and despised hikers wandering off trail. They leased a grazing parcel on the forest boundary and were known for chasing people off with threats. They didn't like nosy folks, or the outfitter said, especially someone like Walt, who was always poking around. But when deputies followed up, there was nothing concrete, no evidence those men had even been in the area that day. A former deputy offered another angle, one tied less to personalities than to cash. Those hills, he explained, had long been a haven for small-scale operations, poaching deer out of season, digging up wild ginseng root to sell under the table, trapping animals for pelts. Each of those was illegal in its own way, but they shared a common thread. They required secrecy. Hunters and diggers sometimes carved out hidden stash spots in caves, hollow logs, or covered pits to keep goods out of sight until they could be sold. Someone nosing into the wrong place could be seen as a threat. Did Walt, obsessed with maps and trails, stumble onto one of those hidden caches? The theory had weight, but again, no proof. Other accounts carried a more personal edge. A bartender in town recalled Walt coming in once, not long before he vanished, and getting into a quiet but tense argument with a younger man wearing a ball cap. The bartender couldn't recall the man's name, but the argument stuck. Walt had raised his voice, unusual for him, and said something about kids getting hurt up there. The man in the cap had leaned close, muttered something, and walked out. To the bartender, it felt like a threat. But with no name, no follow-up, it became one more thread dangling in a case already knotted with them. For investigators, these stories blurred together into a frustrating pattern: rumor without evidence, suspicion without fact. There was no body, no trace of blood, no witness who had seen Walt anywhere past the trail register. Everything after that was conjecture. Without a crime scene, the sheriff's office couldn't call it foul play. Without a confirmed sighting, search and rescue couldn't justify risking lives in the caves. The case sat between categories, and in that gap, it began to wither. The years that followed were marked by anniversaries that reopened wounds without healing them. Local news stations would run brief features, stock footage of the trailhead, an old photo of Walt smiling in a flannel shirt, his daughter speaking softly about the need for answers. Each time, tips trickled in. Someone thought they'd seen a man matching his description hitchhiking near the interstate. Someone else claimed to have heard a strange story in a hunting camp. None panned out. One tip, 2 years in, came with such conviction that deputies spent a week digging in a clearing. Nothing was there. At the 6-year mark, a man called the sheriff's office claiming responsibility for Walt's death. He gave vague details, spoke in a low voice, and said the body was where the water runs under. Deputies treated it as serious until they traced the call to a payphone 2 counties away. The man was identified as a known drifter who had made false confessions before. It was a hoax, a cruel one, and it deepened the family's sense that the truth was being twisted into something unrecognizable. Through it all, Walt's daughter refused to let the case go dormant in her own life. She kept pressing for renewed searches, especially in the cave fields that had been bypassed during the storm. She wrote letters, made calls, met with officials, but every time the answer came back the same. Without new evidence or probable cause, the resources couldn't be allocated. Cave searches were dangerous, costly, and had to be justified. In the language of bureaucracy, her father's life wasn't enough. By the time the 10th anniversary passed, the town had folded the case into its long list of unsolveds. It was a story to tell newcomers at the bar, a warning parents gave their kids about wandering too far, a name that surfaced once a year on the news before vanishing again. For the family, though, the rumors never dulled the ache. Each one carried the possibility of truth, but none delivered it. The mountain had swallowed Walt Emery whole, and the valley below had filled the silence with speculation. What remained was a simple, heavy fact. 17 years later, the only certainty was that no one had ever looked deeply enough into the caves. 17 years after Walt Emery vanished, the mountain finally shifted. The summer of 2025 brought record drought, the kind that left streams running dry and old rock faces shedding layers. Two alpine climbers, exploring a seldom visited buttress of Elk Ridge, paused when they noticed a fresh rockfall scar. The talus looked new, sharp edges where the weather hadn't yet softened the stone. At its base was a shadow that shouldn't have been there, a dark slot where light seemed to stop. Standing in the heat, they felt a draft, cold air pushing outward, carrying the smell of damp stone from somewhere deep inside. They pushed in carefully, headlamps cutting thin beams through the black. The slot narrowed before opening into a sloping corridor, jagged walls shining wet in places. 50 feet in, the climber in front froze. At his feet stood a neat stack of 2 stones, and just beyond it, another. Cairns. Small, deliberate, spaced at intervals that couldn't be random. Each one seemed to mark a path heading deeper. The men exchanged only a few words before turning back. They weren't cavers, and what they had stumbled into felt far beyond their skill. Back at camp, they made the call. Within a week, the site was secured by authorities. A cave rescue team from out of state arrived with ropes, harnesses, and mapping equipment. Anchors were drilled into the mouth of the slot and survey lines were set. The passage twisted and dipped through narrow squeezes, opening into a chamber barely 4 feet high. The floor was littered with rockfall, but in one corner, something broke the pattern. A faded nylon stuff sack, wedged under a stone slab, held items that didn't belong to anyone on the rescue team. Inside was a folded foil blanket, brittle at the edges, a disposable camera in a cloudy Ziploc bag, the kind sold cheaply in gas stations in the 2000s, and a laminated survival card with notes and codes, at the bottom, signed in faded ink, W. Emery. The chamber fell silent. For nearly 2 decades, the valley had speculated about whether Walt had even set foot beyond the ridge that day. Now, lying in the dirt before them, was proof. His pack items had made it underground, into a cave no map showed, through a slot no one had known existed before the drought tore it open. The significance was immediate. The man hadn't just disappeared into weather. He had entered a hidden place and left his mark. Yet the discovery brought no body, no clear trace of what had happened after. There were no bones scattered in the chamber, no signs of struggle, no obvious foul play. Just objects preserved by cold air and darkness, telling the world that Walt had been here, that he had tried to survive, that he had left behind the same careful tools he always carried. Investigators lifted the sack with gloved hands, cataloging each piece. To them, it wasn't closure. It was an opening, a doorway into a deeper mystery. For his family, the call came with both relief and devastation. Proof of presence meant Walt hadn't simply walked off trail and vanished in the storm. He had entered the mountain. But the absence of his remains meant there were still questions, and after 17 years, answers were harder than ever to find. The cave team marked the chamber, mapped its passages, and prepared to go further. Because if Walt had left cairns leading in, the implication was clear. He had gone beyond where they now stood. The drought had exposed the cave. The cairns had confirmed his passage. The sack had given him back his name. But the man himself was still missing in the dark, and whatever secrets he carried into that place were waiting to be uncovered. As the rescue team pressed deeper into the newly opened cave, it became clear this was no simple chamber. The passages twisted like veins under the ridge, splitting and tightening until even the most experienced cavers had to crawl flat to push through. They named one pinch point the tooth, a jagged squeeze that scraped packs and left helmets ringing against stone. Beyond it, the floor dropped toward a sump, an old channel where water once ran, now bone dry from the drought. The cave was alive with silence, the kind that pressed on the ears, broken only by the drip of condensation and the scratch of rope against rock. In a side pocket of the system, one of the caver's headlamps caught a metallic edge. Tucked into a hollow beneath fallen slabs was a steel ammo can, rusted around the hinge but sealed with layer after layer of duct tape. The team hauled it carefully to the surface for forensic opening. When the tape was cut, What spilled out did not belong in a hiker's survival kit. Inside were random fragments of lives, wallet IDs from people whose names no one immediately recognized. A tarnished silver locket, its clasp broken, empty where a photo might once have been. 2 pocket knives dulled by time and use. A ring of keys dangling from a motel tag with faded numbers still etched into the plastic. None of it screamed ownership by Walt Emery. If anything, it looked like a stash collected piece by piece from others. But alongside it was something far more disturbing. A vacuum-sealed roll of microcassettes, carefully wrapped against moisture, and a ledger page covered in grease, scribbled with a list of first names. Some names had lines through them, others stood alone, untouched. Investigators faced an impossible crossroads. One interpretation was brutal. Walt himself had gathered these items for reasons no one could explain. But the other theory made more sense. Perhaps Walt had stumbled onto someone else's hidden cache and never had the chance to leave with what he'd found. The survival blanket, the laminated card, the cairns, they all suggested a man trying to endure, not hide crimes. If the ammo can belong to someone else, then Walt might have discovered more than he was meant to see. The cave itself gave another clue. Near the sump, where the limestone softened into pale, chalky walls, a message had been scratched with something sharp. The letters were faint but legible. Water south, night voices not alone. The words froze everyone who read them. They didn't sound like a hiker's notes. They sounded like a warning, a final record of what had been heard and seen down here in the dark. Forensic teams bagged the can and its contents, logging each object as evidence. The motel key was traced, but had long since changed ownership. The IDs raised alarms. Some belonged to people reported missing years earlier, others to names never entered into any database. The ledger page remained a riddle, grease-stained and cryptic. But the scratched message on the stone was the detail no one could shake. 17 years earlier, the search for Walt had ended with no body, no tracks, nothing but a boot print and a cairn. Now, standing in a cave littered with objects that didn't belong to him, investigators realized they weren't just looking at the remains of a hiker's misadventure. They were standing in a place that had been used before by someone with reason to hide what they had taken. The cave was no longer just the place where Walt had gone missing. It was a chamber of secrets, and those secrets were beginning to point toward people who had never wanted to be found. Technicians worked through the night to preserve what had been sealed in that ammo can for nearly 2 decades. The roll of microcassettes, vacuum-packed against moisture, was brittle in its casing but miraculously intact. Each tape was digitized slowly, the audio run through filters to lift voices out of the static. What emerged was faint, distorted, and chilling. At first, there was only background noise, dripping water, the constant hum of underground air. But then words began to surface. Men's voices, low and tense, carried a dialect unmistakably local to the valley. They argued about moving them before the rain and about park rangers sniffing. The conversation wasn't about hunting or supplies, it was about people. Another voice cut through, quieter, older. It asked plainly if anyone had been hurt. The question hung there before a sharper response snapped back. "You don't belong down here, old man." After that came muffled scuffling, the rush of water being disturbed, and one sharp metallic crack against stone. Not a gunshot, but the kind of sound a tool or weapon makes when it strikes rock. The tape continued for minutes more, filled with nothing but dripping groundwater, and faintly, the low hum of a generator somewhere close. The possibility that this audio captured the final moments of Walt Emery's life shifted the entire investigation. Detectives cross-referenced property records from 2008, focusing on parcels bordering the karst field where the cave had opened. One lease stood out, a grazing tract held by Earl Lang and his son, Mason. Locals remembered the pair well. Earl had a reputation as a hard man, quick to anger, while Mason had grown up under his shadow, often seen hauling equipment for small engine repairs out of a converted trailer. Earl had died in 2016 of natural causes. Mason, now in his late 30s, still lived in the valley and operated a mobile small engine shop servicing ranchers and hunters. What unsettled investigators most wasn't just the property records, it was the ledger page recovered from the ammo can. Grease-stained and torn, it carried a list of first names, not full names, not dates, just first names scrawled as if to keep track of people rather than items. When detectives overlaid that list with unsolved local disappearances stretching back more than a decade, several matched. A seasonal worker who had vanished in 2005, a teenage trail crew member lost in 2002, a young man passing through the county in 2007. Their first names were on the page, marked in the same shaky hand. The evidence, though circumstantial, began forming a disturbing picture. The cave wasn't just a random shelter where Walt had taken refuge. It appeared to have been used deliberately, a hidden site tied to men who had reason to keep outsiders away. If the voices on the tapes were indeed Earl and Mason, then Walt hadn't just stumbled into a storm, he had stumbled into their world. His laminated card, his foil blanket, his cairns, all pointed to a man trying to leave clues, but the audio suggested he had been confronted before he ever had a chance to escape. For the family, the revelation was crushing. For years, they had been told Walt was simply too old to survive a sudden cold front. Now it seemed he may have survived the storm itself, only to encounter something far more dangerous underground. Detectives pored over the tapes again and again, catching details in the background, a phrase about the red gate, the rumble of equipment, the muttered threat of not here, not now. Each piece hinted that the cave was part of a larger pattern, a network of secrecy and fear in the valley's backcountry. The case file, once thin, now thickened with new leads. Mason Lang was no longer just a name on old lease papers. He was a living connection to voices captured in the dark 17 years earlier. But without direct admission, and with his father gone, the line between rumor and evidence remained thin. The sheriff's office knew one thing for certain: the cave had not just hidden the body of a missing hiker. It had held the echoes of crimes that stretched back years, and the voices under stone were finally telling a story the valley had tried to forget. The cave discovery had shifted the case from folklore into evidence, but turning suspicion into prosecution required a level of detail the sheriff's office had never managed in the 17 years since Walt disappeared. Detectives began with the geography. If the Langs had used the cave system as a storage site, there had to be access points they controlled, trails they knew that others did not. Investigators studied old maps and property lines, overlaying them with the cave survey conducted by the rescue team. They identified 3 likely exits that would have once connected to the surface. One, now collapsed, aligned almost perfectly with the boundary of the Langs' leased grazing parcel in 2008. An aerial photo from that year confirmed it. A ramshackle shed once stood beside a dry wash at the edge of the property. It was gone now, rotted and caved in, but its shadow in the old imagery showed the footprint. Detectives sent a team with ground-penetrating radar to sweep the wash. The scans lit up with anomalies, disturbed soil patterns, voids inconsistent with natural erosion. It didn't prove bodies, but it did suggest the ground had been opened and filled again. For a family that had waited nearly 2 decades, the idea that graves could be hidden just feet from a leased pasture was devastating. Forensic scientists turned their focus to the contents of the ammo can. The duct tape, degraded and sticky, yielded partial DNA profiles. One matched the genetic line of the deceased Earl Lang. The second, an unknown male, could not yet be identified, but didn't match Walt or anyone in his family. On the length of rope bundled inside, fibers carried faint traces of the same partial profile. The strongest clue came from the disposable camera bag. Careful swabbing revealed touch DNA consistent with Walt himself, proof he had handled it inside the cave. The lab notes made it clear. Walt had been there, alive, documenting his surroundings. When the camera film was developed, the images were grainy but haunting. 8 exposures survived. The first 4 were of the cave itself, foggy frames of stacked cairns in the distance, a narrow passage bending into darkness, and the blurred outline of someone's hand holding the laminated survival card. The 5th was the most striking. A blurred boot captured mid-step at the narrow chokepoint cavers had named the Tooth. The tread pattern looked close to Walt's worn hiking shoes, but the angle was too unclear to be definitive. It was evidence, but not certainty. Then came the 9th shot. Unlike the others, it was overexposed, light blasting across the frame, but in the corner, faintly visible, was the outline of a rusted ATV. Experts compared it against equipment once owned by the Langs, noted in photos from ranch supply receipts and neighbors' recollections. The resemblance was strong. If authentic, the picture placed Walt outside the cave at some point, documenting not just cairns, but what he may have believed was a link to the men controlling the land. The discovery electrified the investigation, but also exposed its weaknesses. There were still no bodies recovered, no murder weapon, no eyewitness living to corroborate what the tapes had suggested. Prosecutors reviewed the file and hesitated. A jury would see fragments, a missing hiker, circumstantial evidence tying locals to a cave system, a list of names in Greece, but no physical remains, no time of death, and no confession. Without those, a defense attorney could dismiss the story as speculation, arguing that Walt's obsession with missing persons led him into dangerous terrain where he was injured or trapped, and that the items in the ammo can could have been left by anyone. Detectives pressed harder, expanding their timeline around the Langs' property. Former ranch hands remembered Earl and Mason bringing fuel drums and generator parts up toward the grazing parcel in the summer of 2007, claiming they needed light for night calving. Others described hearing machinery in the hills at odd hours, far from any homestead. In light of the tapes referencing a generator, those accounts became more ominous. But memories fade, and witnesses were reluctant, afraid of being dragged into a case that was suddenly making headlines again. Even within the task force, frustration mounted. Every new lead seemed to circle back into the same problem. The core of the case still rested underground, in a cave system too unstable to fully excavate. Forensic teams had pulled every surface item they could find, but what lay deeper remained untouched, sealed behind collapses that would require weeks of specialized digging. Funding was uncertain, and the danger to cavers was high. Each request for expansion met with the same bureaucratic language prosecutors had used for years: insufficient probable cause. For Walt's daughter, who had carried the fight longest, the evidence was bittersweet. The camera proved her father had lived long enough to mark his way and try to leave a record. The DNA proved he had touched the tools of survival inside that cave, and yet those same clues revealed how close he had been to exposing something larger and how thoroughly that truth had been buried. She stood at press conferences holding his survival card, laminated and worn, the signature W. Emery still visible at the bottom. He didn't just get lost, she told reporters. He found something he wasn't meant to find. Behind the scenes, detectives kept threading the pieces together. The ledger names matched unsolved disappearances. The tapes captured voices that fit the Langs. The aerial photos placed suspicious structures near the cave. The DNA pointed to contact between Walt and Earl. To investigators, the case felt solved in everything but legal standing. To prosecutors, it remained a patchwork too fragile to take to court. It was the tension that defined so many cold cases, truth known in the heart, but unproven in the record. What Walt had uncovered in that cave pointed to crimes buried as deeply as he had been, and while time had finally unearthed fragments, it had not yet given them the one thing needed to turn suspicion into justice: undeniable proof. Detectives had built their case slowly, piece by piece, but it wasn't until they secured a warrant for Mason Lang's property that the threads began to tighten into something undeniable. Mason, now nearly 40, still operated his small engine repair business out of a converted garage, the kind of place where grease soaked into every surface and the smell of fuel lingered in the air. Customers came and went for lawnmowers and ATVs, never imagining that behind the roll-up door and metal shelves sat answers to a 17-year mystery. The warrant covered his shop truck, the storage locker he rented on the edge of town, and the trailer he used to haul equipment. Forensics went in first. In the back of the truck, beneath tarps and toolboxes, they found a portable generator. The casing was dented, worn, and its serial numbers had been partially filed down, as if someone wanted to obscure its origin without erasing it entirely. The sound it made when tested, a low, uneven hum, was disturbingly similar to the background noise captured on the old microcassettes. In the storage locker, under boxes of carburetors and scrap parts, detectives uncovered a small ring of keys attached to a faded plastic motel tag. The tag's number matched one of the sets pulled from the ammo can inside the cave. It was the kind of link prosecutors had been desperate for, a physical bridge between what had been hidden underground and what Mason had in his possession nearly 2 decades later. Confronted with the evidence, Mason tried at first to dismiss it. He claimed the generator had been salvaged, the key tag picked up at a flea market, the connections all coincidental. But the investigators weren't relying on those items alone. They had the tapes, degraded but clear enough to distinguish voices, and they had matched one of them with high confidence to Mason's speech patterns. When the audio was played for him in the interview room, his body language shifted. He dropped his eyes, tapped his foot against the floor, and finally sighed. What came next was not a clean confession, but a flood of self-preservation. Mason admitted that the cave had been what he called a drop, a place his father had established years earlier to stash stolen goods and supplies that couldn't be left in plain sight. It was remote, cold, and secret, accessible only to those who knew the limestone field. According to Mason, Earl Lang had used it to hide contraband, including illegally poached game and ginseng root, but it hadn't stopped there. Mason claimed that at least twice people had been kept inside. Migrant workers who had taken cash advances they couldn't repay, forced into silence and hidden away until they were moved on. And once, a teenage trail hand who had stumbled too close to their operation and threatened to talk. He insisted that he had never wanted to be part of it. "That was my father's doing," he said. "Earl had been the violent one, the one who issued threats and carried out punishments." Mason painted himself as the unwilling son, dragged along because there was no choice, bound by fear and obligation. He claimed his role had been to haul equipment, to keep watch, to fix what broke. When the questioning turned to 2008, the day Walt vanished, Mason grew restless. He admitted the old man had been in the cave. He described him as sharp, alert, asking questions that cut too close. Walt had mentioned the names of the missing, accused them of hiding things, pressed for the truth. Mason said there had been a scuffle but denied any violence beyond restraint. "I left him by the water," he said, referring to the sump chamber. "He was fine when I walked out." To him, the storm and the collapse that followed were responsible for whatever happened next. He insisted he hadn't killed Walt, that the mountain had. But even as he tried to distance himself, Mason slipped. In describing his exit from the cave, he mentioned something investigators had never told him. An old exit that had collapsed the week after the storm. It was a detail only someone with intimate knowledge of the system could have known. Detectives seized on it. If true, it meant there was another sealed chamber, one that might contain the very evidence prosecutors needed, evidence Mason had hoped time and rock would bury forever. The interview ended with Mason in custody, his words carefully transcribed, his demeanor alternating between defensiveness and resignation. For investigators, it wasn't the perfect confession. He had shifted blame onto a dead father, denied personal responsibility, and left critical details vague. But he had tied himself to the cave, to the generator, to the key tag, and to the voices on the tapes. He had admitted that Walt Emery had been there, alive, asking questions no one else dared to ask. The case file that once seemed too fragile to hold up in court was now thick with links. Still, detectives knew the fight wasn't over. Mason's words were useful, but words could be twisted. What they needed was the collapsed exit he had mentioned, the final lead that could turn a story into proof. If they found it, the mountain might at last reveal what it had hidden since the night Walt vanished. It took weeks of preparation before the cave rescue teams were willing to attempt it. Mason Lang had mentioned the old exit, the one that collapsed after the 2008 storm, but his description was vague. He drew a rough sketch for investigators, 2 ridgelines, a washout, a boulder split like a tooth. On paper, it looked like half of Elk Ridge. Still, when cavers retraced the survey lines and cross-checked with Mason's directions, they identified one promising section where the passage dead-ended in a wall of scree. Rocks there looked fresher than surrounding stone, as if gravity had only recently sealed them in place. Anchors were set, and over days, crews hauled out debris bucket by bucket. Dust filled the narrow corridor. Every sound echoed, bouncing back like whispers. Then, on the 5th day, the drill bit into stone that shifted. A hollow thump followed. Behind the collapse, There was air. The crew widened the breach until a single caver could squeeze through. What they found was no open chamber, but a narrow alcove, hardly more than a stone pocket. The headlamps revealed bones curled in the dust. Human remains, tucked beside two stacked stones, too high, balanced carefully, the unmistakable cairn signature Walt had always left behind. It was as if, even in his last moments, he'd tried to mark his way, to leave a sign for whoever might come after. The recovery was methodical. Forensics moved the bones gently, one piece at a time. Among them, they found a femur with signs of a healed fracture, the kind of injury Walt had suffered years earlier after a fall in his classroom left him with a limp that never fully faded. The medical examiner's later report confirmed what the team already suspected: perimortem blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with striking a rock surface during a fall or struggle. This was not a man who had simply laid down to die of cold. He had fought, and the mountain had sealed him where he fell. But the alcove held more than bones. Wedged beneath a slab was a final Ziploc bag, worn but still sealed. Inside was a folded map, its back scribbled with words in Walt's steady hand. If found, there are two men. The boy is still alive. The creek bed behind the red gate. The writing was cramped, as if jotted quickly, but it carried the weight of someone who knew he might not escape. Investigators followed the clue immediately. The Red Gate had long been a reference point in town lore, a rusted cattle gate marking an abandoned track that cut behind the Lang's former grazing lease. Deputies and forensic teams converged there, bringing cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. Within hours, the soil beneath the dry creek bed lit up with anomalies, two distinct shapes. Excavation began under tarps, shielded from the press already circling the story. What they uncovered were two shallow graves. The first held the skeletal remains of a young male, no older than 17. The second, a man in his 20s. Personal effects were buried with them: fragments of a canvas work jacket, a rusted belt buckle, a pocket knife with initials worn smooth. DNA testing confirmed the identities: the teenage trail hand who had disappeared in 2002, the seasonal worker who had gone missing in 2005. Cases once dismissed as lost hikers were now revealed as victims. Forensics tied everything together. Items from the graves matched names on the grease-stained ledger found in the cave. DNA from the duct tape and rope inside the ammo can match partial profiles of Earl Lang. And in the cave itself, alongside Walt's belongings, were fingerprints consistent with Mason. It was a chain of evidence that prosecutors had once claimed was impossible. Now, piece by piece, it had been unearthed. The news hit the valley with the force of a storm. For nearly 2 decades, townspeople had traded rumors about Walt, about the Langs, about the Ridge. Now the rumors hardened into fact. Press conferences drew crowds of reporters. The sheriff stood at the podium, flanked by forensic photos and timelines, announcing charges against Mason Lang for felony murder and kidnapping. His father, Earl, named posthumously, was accused of orchestrating the earlier crimes, his violence buried with him, but no longer secret. For Walt's family, the discovery was both a vindication and a fresh wound. They had been told he was simply too old to survive a storm, that he had probably curled up under a tree and never woken. Instead, the truth was harsher. He had found the cave, confronted men who used it for their hidden world, and been killed in the struggle that followed. His laminated survival card, his foil blanket, his cairns, all of it had been part of a desperate attempt not only to stay alive but to leave a trail for others. The disposable camera images now seemed prophetic. Cairns, his hand holding the survival card, a blurred boot at the tooth, and finally that overexposed shot of a rusted ATV. They were his evidence, his attempt to capture the truth on film before it was too late. His final note, scribbled on the back of a map, had led directly to the graves of 2 forgotten victims. Even in death, Walt had refused to let the secrets of Elk Ridge remain hidden. The courtroom proceedings unfolded slowly, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Mason, faced with the mountain of proof and the damning audio tapes, pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for avoiding a death sentence. He admitted his father had been the one to draw him into it, that Earl had taught him the drop was more than just a place for stolen goods. Mason claimed he had never wanted blood on his hands, but his role in helping conceal victims made him complicit. The law treated him accordingly. For the valley, closure came in pieces. Families of the trail hand and the seasonal worker finally had their sons returned, their names spoken aloud at memorials that had once been empty of bodies. Walt's daughter received her father's final note, laminated now by forensics but still bearing his steady script. She held it at the memorial service, telling those gathered that he had died as he lived, trying to protect others, trying to uncover the truth. 17 years after he signed the trail register to see the first snow, Walt Emery's story closed not in mystery but in revelation. He had not wandered off and vanished into weather. He had uncovered a hidden cave, a criminal world buried under the valley's surface, and paid for it with his life. The cairns he left behind, the survival tools he packed, the notes he scribbled in the dark, they were his voice carried forward. The cave had hidden him for nearly 2 decades, but in the end, it did more than conceal. It preserved his evidence, his signs, his message, and when the mountain finally let go, it told the truth he had died trying to carry out. Walt Emery's cairns led rescuers not only to his own remains, but to the justice of others who had been lost before him. The silence of Elk Ridge was broken, and the secrets beneath stone no longer belonged to the men who buried them, but to the families who finally knew.